Hey, F50Woman. Thank you for joining us. I am here today with Jennifer Steil. She is an award-winning author, journalist, and a teacher. She has been in places in the world that I can only imagine. And I can't wait to hear about her journey. I can't wait for her to share it with you all. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I was reading about you and I was like, what is that like? I've pretty much lived in the Northeast all of my life. My parents are West Indian. I was born in Canada, but pretty much since I was 10, I was in the Northeast. So that is what I know, except for a little bit of visits to Barbados and Florida and typical kind of trips. I was so fascinated by how your journey happened, what you started out like. And that's what I'd love to start with. What were you like as a young woman? What did you want to be? Who were you?
Well, I'll first start out by saying that I did originate from the Northeast, from a small town in Massachusetts.
Nice.
Uh,
Okay.
so that's where I grew up as a child. As a young woman, I was a theater major as an undergraduate, and I was interested in becoming an actor. I was determined to become an actor. And I moved to Seattle to begin my acting career because I was too intimidated by New York City. Seattle had a thriving theater scene, and I'd never been there. And so I drove across country to become an actor in Seattle. And as a young woman, I was very idealistic, a little bit naive, but very independent. I got very impatient with any job that required me to work regular hours. So I was extremely impoverished. I was living on, I think, $5,000 a year without debt at the time.
Wow.
The debt happened later when I went to grad school, but this is
Yeah.
before that. I was a barista and a waitress, and I
Mhm.
sorted recycling crates and put corks in wine bottles and did pretty much every kind of random blue collar job you could do in Seattle that didn't require a long term commitment. And anytime a temp job would say, "We want to hire you on a full time basis," look at the time, I have to go. So that's who I was. I was mostly performing in the theater. I was involved with creative communities. I loved being in Seattle, in the city, in the mountains. I loved exploring. I did dream about living abroad then, but living abroad seemed to be something that only very wealthy people could do, people who inherited wealth or married wealth. And on 5,000 a year, I wasn't even taking
Right.
vacations. I just didn't know how people ended up living abroad. I didn't understand that there were jobs that would take you there or where to find those jobs. I just didn't have the resources.
Mhm.
So I just worked as an actor and did a bunch of other jobs.
Mhm.
So that's where I was in my early 20s.
So who are you now? Tell us about what you do, who you are, what you're like.
Now
Mhm.
I am talking to you from Tashkent, Uzbekistan,
Wow.
in Central Asia. I am a novelist, a memoirist, an essayist, a short story
Mhm.
writer, a journalist. So mostly I'm a writer of all kinds. I still miss theater and
Mhm.
still dream perhaps someday I'll do a bit more theater, but I'm now a writer. It's how I make a living. And weirdly enough, I've made more writing books than doing anything else I've ever
Mhm.
done in my life. That's not how I expected things to turn out, but I took a bunch of strange turns in my life and ended up in a lot of places accidentally. So,
Yeah. So how did you go from Massachusetts to where were you, Washington?
right.
And
Yes.
then to Uzbekistan. Hopefully I said it right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there
How
were a
did,
few stops in between. I left
okay.
Massachusetts at 15 to go to an alternative school in Vermont for my last couple of years
Okay.
of high school. It was on a farm. We got to shovel cow poop. They have carrot day where we harvested carrots and
Mhm.
do lots of art and singing as well as regular. I loved that. That changed my life, that school,
Oh,
the Putney School.
okay.
Then I went off to Oberlin for college and loved Oberlin, hated Ohio. I need mountains. I need mountains.
Wow. Okay.
Flatness doesn't do it for me. Also, I grew up on a coast, and it's hard for me to not be on a coast. I'm talking to you from a double landlocked country.
Are
One
there
of my
any mountains where you are? Did you
Oh,
at
there's
least visit?
lots. Actually,
Okay.
there's some really spectacular mountains in this part of the world. In fact, Kyrgyzstan, which is one of our neighbors,
Hmm.
we're surrounded by stands. There's 5 stands around us. In Kyrgyzstan, they call it the Switzerland of Central Asia. Uzbekistan also has high and stunning mountains. So it has some spectacular scenery. Tashkent itself is flat, and it's a
Okay.
urban sprawl. Perhaps not the most picturesque city I've lived in, but there
Okay.
are some incredibly picturesque cities in this part of the world. How did I get to that? No, or
You
so,
were
oh,
talking
right,
about the different.
landscape, Ohio.
Yeah.
Right. So when I left Ohio, I moved to Seattle to start my acting career. And then I moved after 4 years in Seattle. I ended up in some time in Missoula working with a theater company there. I did end up moving to New York City, um, and lived in New York City for 12 years.
Oh.
And that's where I finished. I got an MFA in creative writing,
Mhm.
realized I still hadn't published anything. I still had no teaching experience. I was probably going to be waitressing till the end of my days if I didn't do something that I could make a living at. And so I went to the Columbia University School of Journalism because I figured at least journalists get a paycheck. It may not be the biggest paycheck in the world, certainly when you're starting out in newspapers, but at least it's something. So I started out in newspapers and worked for small newspapers, at first in Massachusetts, then New Jersey, and then finally made my way back to the city. I missed theater so much that I quit newspapers to switch to magazines and worked as an associate editor at Playgirl magazine. Right. Yeah, I know. I told you there were some interesting turns. Well, I
You're a
got into
writer.
that. Actually, I wrote an essay about that time at Playgirl magazine that ran in the Podunk Review, a literary magazine out of New Orleans. It's called The Braille Machine, that essay. I
Okay.
believe it's probably online. Anyway, so I worked there. I worked for a friend of mine from graduate school. So there was a little bit of nepotism, but they still made me work hard to get that job. I had to write pitches, write stories, and go through interviews. It was an
Mhm.
incredibly rigorous hiring process. And I had a lot of fun working there. I learned a lot of interesting things,
Okay.
but was eventually fired for lack of respect for authority, which again is its own story.
Yeah.
I think it's important to include these things because no
Yes.
no one's road is really linear, and you don't just succeed at everything along the way. I was
Yes.
really sad when I was fired because I was planning to write this terrific expose about writing for Playgirl magazine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Uh,
Did you ever do it? That's something
no, I
you
mean
do
I've
after
written
you
the
leave.
yeah, yeah. I mean I had to make do with just the essay, and I did write. I took a course in Manhattan in one woman performance art at some point, and
Hmm.
started doing a short performance piece based just on getting fired from Playgirl that I did at a couple open mics in New York when I
Wow.
lived.
Okay.
I don't know what happened to that script, but anyway, that was fun.
Where can we see the taping of it? Check it
I
out.
don't, this was a long time ago.
Before
I was,
Facebook and cell phones.
I'm a late adapter of technology, so I didn't have
Right.
a cell phone till pretty late. But so when I worked briefly at a couple other magazines before I ended up at The Week, a news magazine based in New York, and I helped launch it already existed in the UK and it was very successful there. They wanted to launch it in the US, and I was one of the original hires to help do that. So I started off as a science and health writer. Those are special interests of mine, and I'd been doing a lot of health writing in the news for the newspaper in New Jersey. I'd won an award for my health writing. So I
Yeah.
think that's why they hired me. Or maybe they just hired me because my boss knew I'd been working at Playgirl and he was like, "So what was that like?" But
Yeah.
anyway,
Those older projects sometimes get you into the new ones. Yeah.
it's true, though, because my professors from journalism school said, whatever you do, don't tell anyone you worked at Playgirl. Take it off your CV.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. They said it's going to make you look illegitimate as a journalist. And then I seriously do think my editor, when I had my job interview at The Week, that's what they were most interested in talking with me about. And I
Wow.
thought,
Okay.
if it weren't for that, maybe they wouldn't have hired me. Maybe
Right.
it made me look more interesting. And I think also the fact that one of the editors who interviewed me had worked for Penthouse. So we had porn in common, which is a weird thing to say about people you write at a news magazine
Right.
for. But
Yeah.
anyway,
How'd you get your job? We had porn in common.
How
That's
it
a story.
happened.
Yeah.
So I worked there for the longest I worked anywhere that required semi-regular hours.
Okay.
And it was a good job. It was a good job. I learned a lot because I was writing about something different every day. I was reading scientific studies, I was reading health studies, and eventually I was allowed to also write the film page and then the theater page. So I picked up extra pages as
Mhm.
I stayed there longer and got promoted. And now we're coming up to the pivot point. Are we
Okay.
ready for that?
We are ready for it. Yes. I can't wait to hear because, yes, please share that with us.
Okay, so in 2006, I was still working for the week, and a friend of mine from high school, my high school boyfriend, wrote to me from Yemen and said, "How would
From
you like to come
Yemen.
from
Okay.
Yemen?"
Wow. Did you know he was there or were you like, you're where? You're doing what?
I did not know he was there.
Okay.
I was not surprised to hear from him because
Okay.
we've been in touch off and on since high school. He was just one of those people that kept popping in and out of my life. I think the reason he contacted me in this specific instance is that he didn't know any other journalists and he knew I was working as a journalist. He had done a little bit of writing for the Yemen Observer, which is this Yemeni owned newspaper in Sana'a, Yemen. And he realized pretty quickly that no one at the newspaper had any training in journalism. He wrote to me and said, "Would you be willing to move to Yemen and train these journalists?" And I said, "I have a rent stabilized apartment and healthcare.
Yep.
I can't just run off to Yemen. I didn't speak Arabic. I'd never been to the Middle East or Arabia. But at the same time, I was intrigued
Mhm.
because I'd always had these fantasies about living abroad. When I thought about it, I thought about, oh, I'm going to be like Henry Miller, Anais Nin, and I'm going to go live in Paris. And of course, those people were supported financially by other people. I was living alone in Manhattan, supporting myself, not on a salary that could afford me a very fancy life in Paris. So
Right.
that hadn't happened. Yemen wasn't in my plans, but Yemen
Mhm.
was being offered to me. I said, look, I've got 3 weeks vacation left this year. What if I just came for 3 weeks and did a training for the journalists of the paper? He spoke to the owner of the paper who said, yes, please come. So
Okay.
I got on a plane with my Learn Arabic in 10 minutes a day workbook.
Too bad you didn't have those apps they have now, which can translate as you talk. But
I really could have used that the first year, but I might not have learned as much Arabic as I did.
exactly.
I learned some basics before I went,
Mhm.
please, thank you, and then numbers because money is important and being able to argue with taxi drivers is
Right.
very important. So, and you also
Okay.
have to learn how to say, that's crazy. I'm not paying that. That is a very important phrase.
Do you
Uh,
remember how to say it?
Majnoon is crazy.
That's fairly not super complicated to get the American tongue to say.
That wasn't one of the more difficult words. There are kind of 3 letters that all sound like gra to me, but I got better. I moved to Yemen and the city of Sana'a, the old city of Sana'a, is hands down the most beautiful place I have ever seen. It looked like it came out of a fairy tale.
Wow.
The buildings look like gingerbread houses. If you make
Yes.
them out of dark gingerbread and then have white frosting on the edges,
Mhm.
picture those gingerbread houses stacked up tall, but with stained glass windows.
Wow.
They were exquisite houses. I was stunned by the beauty of the city, but even more stunned
Mhm.
by the people of Yemen, who were the world's friendliest people. I had never been anywhere in my life that was so hospitable and so
Wow.
friendly and so welcoming. Everywhere I went, people would say to me, "We love you. Welcome to Yemen." I'd be walking down the street and they would
Okay.
and they'd be like, "We love you. Welcome to Yemen." And they would mean it. They would be very sincere about it.
Yeah.
And I thought this was wonderful. I suddenly had the experience of what it must be like to be Julia Roberts or something. My reporters were pretty amazing people. They were ambitious, they were curious, they had a million questions for me. They were both male and female, probably evenly divided between men and women. I knew nothing about their culture or countries. They were constantly teaching me about Yemen, about their culture. They were helping me with Arabic homework because I started studying Arabic right away. And I loved working with them. At the end of those 3 weeks, which were so exciting, and I felt kind of invigorated in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt useful in a way that I didn't feel in New York. In New
Hmm.
York, there were dozens of journalists who could
Right.
have done my job perfectly, whereas these Yemeni journalists didn't have anyone else to help them. They wanted me to help them. When it came time for me to leave, they didn't want me to go. The owner of the newspaper said, "The staff really likes you. I like what you're doing with the newspaper. Would you be willing to take over as editor in chief for a year?" And this is what he says, which still makes me laugh. And I thought, okay, like, there's no way.
There
I
you
was like, that's a real challenge. I said, well, I've never worked at the New York Times, and what are you prepared to pay me? And which was about $12,000 for the year. And I said, well, that's a little bit less than I make in Manhattan. And he said, well, you won't even come close to spending that here. It's impossible. I mean, at the time, everything in Yemen was so inexpensive. He said, $12,000, you'll live like royalty, which is true.
Wow.
I know. So I said, well, I'll think about it, but I don't know if I can swing it. So I went back to New York, and then I went back to the office. Same gray walls, same cubicle,
Yeah.
same colleagues. And
Perspective completely shifted, I'm sure. Look the same anymore.
no. And the other thing was that no one was very curious to hear about Yemen. And I thought,
Why
why
not?
aren't people interested? They don't know anything about Yemen. They've never been there. And
Yeah.
yet no one had any questions for me. And I thought, that's it. I'm moving to Yemen. So I went in the conference room, used the company phone to call Yemen. This is before Zoom. And I called Yemen and I said, if that job's still open, I can be there in 2 weeks. And so that was what changed everything for me. Moving to Yemen changed everything.
Okay. And tell us in what way? How did that change? How did that change you? What happened?
So, first of all, running that newspaper was the most difficult thing I'd ever done. I
Mm.
was completely unprepared for the challenge, but there's no way to learn how to run a newspaper better than running a newspaper
Mm.
or
Yeah.
struggling to run a newspaper and then eventually figuring it out. So, there's all these things that took me a while to figure out. So I learned a great deal professionally, also culturally, kept learning Arabic and all that. But I was working kind of insane hours until my boss took me aside at one point and said, look, he's like, I don't want 100% from you. I want maybe 60% right now, because if you keep going at the rate you're going, you're going to burn out and leave me, and I don't want you to leave. So if you could
Wow.
just
Okay.
work a little less. And I said, I don't, but the paper has to come out, and if I work a little less, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It was a year of really steep learning for me, all uphill and fast, like never a dull moment. It was a fascinating time. I got to meet such incredible people. I loved working with my journalists. We'd get in screaming arguments, and then the next day we'd be best friends. So it was a relationship that was
Mm.
ultimately productive. But at the end of that year, when I was beginning to think about what I was going to do when this year was up, I met the man who would become my husband. And
Does that change everything or what?
yeah, so that changed things. I met him at the French ambassador's house in his garden on Bastille Day. So we never forget the day we met because it happens to be a French holiday.
Is he French too?
No, he's British. He was the British ambassador to Yemen and had just arrived when we met.
Okay.
And it was his first ambassadorial posting. Our daughter was eventually born while we lived in Yemen.
Mm.
And my first book, which was the memoir about my experiences running the newspaper, was published while I lived in Yemen. So Yemen gave me this incredible experience running the newspaper. It helped me sell my first book. I found my husband and I had my daughter. So I'm really not sure what more I could have wanted from that particular pivot. This was not what I anticipated when I left the US. In fact, when I left the US, I was 37. When I met my husband, I was 38. When I left the US, I said to my gynecologist, I don't know if I want children, because I didn't. I wasn't sure, but I thought, do I really want to rule it out? And I assumed that moving to Yemen was ruling out a romantic life and children, because I couldn't really see myself meeting a life partner there. And it
Right.
wasn't supposed to be a long-term thing, just 1 year.
Yeah.
My gynecologist was like, can't make your decisions for you. I think you're nuts, but do what you want to do.
Yeah.
So I did not think that any of this would happen. It changed our lives in other ways as well. 3.5 years into our time in Yemen, when I was living with my husband and I was 6.5 months pregnant, I ended up getting kidnapped at gunpoint by 8 armed men for a
Oh my
day.
goodness.
It was just a day, but the day
Still.
feels long when you don't know if you're going to survive it. And then my husband ended up getting attacked by a suicide bomber on his way to
Wow.
work. So there were some less exciting things that happened, but my first novel, The Ambassador's Wife, was actually inspired by that kidnapping.
Okay.
So that book begins with a kidnapping that's similar to how mine happened, but
Okay.
then takes off in a completely fictional direction.
Okay.
No, this was not terrorist. This was purely opportunistic. And actually, I think more than opportunistic, they were trying to negotiate something in
Okay.
some kind of ransom for our release. But of course, the Brits don't pay ransom, so that doesn't work. I think the man who took us hostage clearly suffered from mental illness
Okay.
because when I was trying to speak with him and explain who we were, he didn't see me. When you look in someone's eyes, you can tell they are not there and that you don't register. It was a really terrifying moment because I thought he doesn't see me as a human.
Yeah.
But we did ultimately get out of that situation.
Okay.
So we were in Yemen for 4 years. So, it's a lot longer than I originally intended on staying. When we left, I was devastated. We only left because we were evacuated.
Okay.
My daughter and I were evacuated. My husband had to stay and finish his posting.
After you were evacuated, you came back to the States. Where did you end up
No.
next?
We didn't have a home anywhere else. My husband had just been through a divorce and no longer had a home.
Yeah.
So we went to Jordan and rented an apartment because we wanted to be within a direct flight to my husband because I had a
Okay.
6-month-old baby and I wasn't all that keen on being alone with her. We were there, but it was only 4 months. And then we were reunited in London. We spent almost 2 years together in London before
Okay.
my husband was posted to Bolivia. And we all moved there together and spent 4 years in Bolivia.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, which is a whole different part of the world, different language, different
Yeah.
culture, different everything.
Yeah.
And
Were you still writing there? Did you keep doing your work, or were you just being mom, or what were you
no,
doing there in Bolivia?
I don't think I've ever just been a mom. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just I'm not sure I'm capable of it. When my daughter was 2 weeks old, I was alone with her in London. My husband was in Yemen. I was living in someone's basement. That's when I started writing again.
You
I
had
don't
to.
know.
Yeah.
So much of infants is just mindless diaper changing, just
Sleeping,
going,
eating, sleeping.
yeah. And I just needed something else to do. And I just
Yeah.
didn't know what else to do other than write. Had I started The Ambassador's Wife? Yeah, I must have. That took me about 5 years to research and write. I finished writing The Ambassador's Wife in Bolivia. And I got the idea for Exile Music, my latest book, early on in our time in Bolivia, because that book is set largely in Bolivia, also in Vienna, but Vienna and Bolivia.
Okay.
So there was also a book in between, just to include the little missteps along the way. There was a book set in New York that I wrote between The Ambassador's Wife and Exile Music that my agent didn't like, and that happens sometimes.
I can't even imagine writing a book for 5 years. That's a lot of dedication, perseverance. I mean, did you ever get to a point where you were like, oh my gosh, can this be done? When you're doing anything, maybe you're so passionate about it and so in the story that it's just you coming out on the pages. What is that like, writing a book?
There are many points where I get incredibly impatient, and I think,
Okay.
why did someone who is as impatient a human as I am
Right.
pick book writing? Because I'm not a patient person. I can't even stand on an escalator. I have to keep moving. And yet it takes 5 years to get a book researched and written. If I'm writing a rough draft, I can steam along.
Mhm.
And that part isn't hard for me because there's so much momentum in that. But most of the real writing happens in the rewrites and the millions of drafts that I end up writing
Okay.
to shape the story and make every detail add up to the ending and contribute to it. And so those rewrites can feel endless. Although I actually really enjoy that phase too. But
Mhm.
there's then once you are working with an editor at a publishing company, and then there's months in between edits and you're just waiting. And then even when the book is done,
Yeah.
they tell you, oh, it's going to be 18 months till it comes out. And you want to be like, are you kidding
I
me?
know.
No.
No, that's not how it's going to work.
Right.
I give you a month. Even harder than having a baby because at least you know the 9 months, and then somewhere around the ninth month we'll be delivering.
Right. There's no chance that pregnancy is going to end up being 24
Yeah,
months.
sorry, ma'am. You'll be, yeah. No one would have babies at that point.
Nope.
Very
Yeah,
interesting. So, two questions. When you were in Bolivia, you learned another language.
I
Okay.
did.
And how
And it was
is it? Is it hard? I guess when you're there, you just immerse into it and your brain just switches. How,
well, I took actual classes in both
okay.
Yemen and Bolivia, the whole 4 years in both countries. By the time
Okay.
I left Yemen, I had passably conversational Arabic, which I've probably all forgotten by now, but I managed pretty well when I was out on my own. And in Bolivia, Spanish is much easier for me anyway, a much
Right.
easier language. So I learned it was a little depressing to me that after 3 months of Spanish, my Spanish was where my Arabic had been like after 4 years. But I love Spanish. I love speaking Spanish. I miss it. It's such a fun language. And of course, it's really useful in the US as well. When I went back to New York, I thought, oh my gosh, this whole world just opened up to me that I couldn't hear before I learned Spanish. Now I
Yeah.
understand more people on the subway. And
When they're walking by or when you're in Starbucks or wherever you go. Yeah, on
right.
the subway. Cool. Cool.
I love that. One more comment I'll make about
Yeah.
that is that there's the best language teacher is necessity. And
Yes.
so I learn best if I'm on my own. My husband, who's way better at languages and knows way more than I am, if he's not with me and I have to ask for things, he generally lets me do that anyway, of course, because he's keen on me being able to learn. But
Yeah.
I mean, you just have to find a way to ask for things
Yeah.
and find your way. And like when Yemen, I had to take taxis alone, so I had to learn how to talk to taxi drivers.
Right.
Yeah.
So along this path of all these different places you lived, who helped you? Did you have a mentor? Did you have people you reached back to? Did you have people who helped you along the way? It could have been mentors. It could have just been good friends or people who walked alongside you when you were like, oh my gosh, what the heck am I doing?
I'll tell you a few people who helped me
Okay.
in critical ways. I had a journalism professor at the Columbia School of Journalism
Okay.
who gave me my first assignment as a reporter while I was still a student of hers. I worked really hard at Columbia. It's a
Mhm.
1 year master's program, but no one eats or sleeps. It's super rigorous and you're on the streets every day and you have a beat and you're turning in stories every day. And it was tough. And I was working incredibly hard. In spring of that year, she called me up and said that Time Magazine needed some reporting on campus. It was right after the death of Bill Cosby's son, and Time Magazine was doing a piece on his death.
Okay.
And so I ended up finding, I'm trying to remember who exactly the source was, a kid that studied with him because his son had been at the teachers college studying
Yeah.
there. So anyways, I had my first byline in Time Magazine, which was kind of exciting for
That's
me
pretty cool.
as a little baby reporter. Eccentric in for example, smoking was against the rules in the building, but she would teach her classes leaning out the window, rolling her own cigarettes. Anyway, she was a character. But when I was applying for internships, I applied for an internship at the Patriot Ledger in Massachusetts, and she called them up and said, if you take Jennifer and she doesn't work out, I will repay every penny you've spent on her salary. Um,
Okay.
so they offered me the position.
Somebody
So
believes in you like that. Yeah.
I felt a little nervous about that. But anyway,
Right.
so that's Carol. She really did help me at Columbia. She was a real supporter. And I needed one because I was one of the most inexperienced people in my class. A lot of these people were mid career journalists. They already had a ton of experience and I'd never done anything. So I was grateful. Then my friend Tom Zollner, who is an utterly brilliant nonfiction writer,
Mhm.
he'd written a few books by the time we met at a cocktail party in Manhattan, and we became really close friends. He visited me in Yemen And he read the book proposal that I wrote for my first book, the one about running the newspaper, and gave me a few suggestions, a few edits, and then said, I wasn't planning on sharing my agent with anyone, but this is so up her alley that I feel compelled to share this proposal with my agent. That was incredibly generous of him as a writer, because sharing an agent is like sharing a parent, and you're always worried that you are not the favored child.
Yes. They'll forget
So,
about me. Now they got
yeah,
you. Yeah.
exactly. Because we'll be like, is she returning your emails? I haven't heard from her. So, but in a fun way, because we're still friends. He really helped me. I don't know where I'd be without my agent. He hooked me up with her, and she rang me in Yemen and said, I want to represent this book.
Nice. Wow.
So,
Okay. If you were to run into yourself in Yemen or in Massachusetts or in New York, and you were a younger woman, what would you advise her? What piece of advice would you give her, your younger self?
right. Does it have to be about any specific part?
Nope.
Like, it has to be
Nope.
professional? Or could it be-
It could be absolutely anything. Anything you would like to have somebody to have told you, or you would tell yourself at a younger age, or wish you had known, or
Right.
yeah, anything.
The one thing that I think about all the time is I wish I had been easier on my body or better at looking after it, because I've always been an obsessive athlete, but not necessarily in a healthy way. So when I was a runner, I ran 7 days a week, which is, at least for my particular body, doesn't work. And it kept falling apart. It kept telling me, this is too much. This is too much. And various
Okay.
parts of me broke. And this has happened with every sport I've ever done. I just wish I'd listened to my body and if you're in pain, don't do the same thing every day. Don't just keep, look, it matters, now that I have terrible kind of spinal problems and nerve pain because of not doing that. So that's one piece of advice. The other piece of advice I would give is take risks, put yourself in situations that terrify you, in places where every assumption you have about the world is challenged, and you will learn things. It wasn't until I moved to Yemen that I even began to unpack the ways in which growing up in the US had shaped me
Yeah.
and shaped my assumptions about the world.
I wish we could all travel somehow. I wish that I could have sent my children even to some of the worst parts of the world to just see, you know what? Life is really not that hard. The way at least they had it when they were growing up. And then just to see, we tend to have a little bit of an insulated point of view. I don't even think I can grasp what you're saying because I haven't really experienced it to that extent, but you can see how it's just opens you up in whole different ways.
Right. I mean, there's so many things you
Lessons
notice when you're outside.
viewpoints, and even the architecture you were talking about, the buildings. I mean, I'm trying to picture the gingerbread houses on top of each other, and I'm still seeing gingerbread houses on top of each other. But just to see it, and even to go from a city to a place where there are mountains, you see it on TV, but real life is just a whole different experience,
Right. And
yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
So when I was living in Yemen, my reporters were appalled by the fact that I lived alone, because no one in Yemen lives alone. They wouldn't want to. They're horrified at the thought of living alone because they're so devoted to their family and their community. It's kind of in that order, family, then community. I loved that. Like, I loved that, childcare wasn't an issue. There was always someone to look after a child. There was always someone to do the cooking or help with the cooking. I came from Manhattan, where like 52% of adults live alone.
Yeah.
So it didn't seem weird, but to them, they were like, oh, I'm so sorry. This is terrible.
Yeah.
You want to come stay with us?
Wow. Okay. Did you end up staying? You stayed alone, or did you end up staying with others?
Well, I did stay alone, but the funny thing is, I loved living alone in New York and thought I always would. But in Yemen, what ended up happening is it started that with coming home one day and finding a sobbing German woman on my stairs who'd just been thrown out of her home. And so I said, well, you can come live with me. And so she did. And I loved living with her. And I got really used to having someone else around. And then I invited another German woman to live with me. And then a Dutch woman and then a second Dutch woman.
All at the
And
same time?
no, there was some
Okay.
overlap. There was a long period where I lived with a Scottish woman who was 12 years older and a Dutch woman who was 12 years younger, and I was right in the middle of them. And that was
Yeah.
great. It was so nice. I'd forgotten it was nice to come home from work and there'd be people. You could talk to them. And
Now, did you keep pictures of these times when you traveled in Yemen and had these roommates? I can picture the movie.
oh yes,
One day it'll be a movie.
yes, I have a ton of photos. I have
Yeah,
photos of all my reporters. I'm still in touch with all my reporters.
it's good. And so everyone is doing well. Is the paper still running?
No, the country's been in the middle of civil war. But my star reporter was a woman named Coco, who, in a way, although she considers me her mentor, in a way she's mine. She would want to come with me to the grocery store. I'd say, Coco, I know how to say these words in Arabic. And she'd be like, no. And I'd be like, I'm old enough to be your mother. And she said, mothering is a feeling. It is not an age. And I'm coming with you. She married a human rights lawyer and fled the country because of death threats to him.
Okay.
And she's now a refugee in Turkey. I saw her last year in Istanbul.
I always, because we read about refugees and civil wars, and I can't even imagine how that feels. I don't want to be somewhere else, but I have no choice to be somewhere else. How is she doing with that emotionally and culturally and physically? It's got to be just devastating in a level I can't imagine.
Yes, that
Yeah.
is certainly true. She is unbelievably competent and ambitious. She's a fiery person. She gets things done. She's not the kind of person who sits around bewailing her outcast state. She just gets on with things. She now has 3 children, but because she was her husband's second wife, because in Yemen you can take 4,
Okay.
and she had never wanted to be a second wife. They never met a woman who wanted there to be any other wives. But
That's an
the
interesting
men,
thought, because I
yeah,
always wondered if in those places where you can have multiple wives, if they're just good with it. Well,
they were
okay.
not good with it.
Okay.
And this is anecdotal evidence. These are not statistics, but the
Right.
women I know, not good with it. There's jealousy and you're time sharing a husband. She's alone right now in Istanbul with 3 kids.
Yeah.
And if she didn't have her sister with her, she would really struggle to both work and parent. Her husband is now in the Netherlands because he couldn't get a job in Istanbul. He's trying to get her to join him, but it was hard enough getting a visa for the first
First
wife.
wife. The second wife, what is that? We don't really understand.
Or the third. I think
Yeah.
we would be like, come on, what are you running over there?
Yeah.
I think her life is quite tough, but she's a tough person.
Okay.
She has been through things and I love her. She's amazing.
Could teach some lessons in how to be, I don't know, maybe you rise to whatever your challenges are. Maybe she can teach some of us how to build that strength, but maybe that's something you have to build when you go through it. Some
Well, I
people
don't
have it.
know.
Yeah.
Some people have natural resilience and some people don't. This interests me a lot. It comes up in my writing, but for her, she's certainly resilient. She does it a lot through work. She's resourceful about finding work for herself and finding meaningful work. She's worked for various UN organizations after working with me, but she also is working for a group to help Yemeni women, help empower Yemeni women. So even though she's not in Yemen, she's very passionate about women's rights and human rights and a keen advocate for those. And, she's continued she went and got a master's degree in Cairo at one point. And we actually crossed paths in Cairo too. It's funny. 4 countries. Isn't that funny? It's crazy.
That's, yeah, like destiny or something. So you, who also seem like a very resilient person, I mean, just being kidnapped when you're pregnant alone could send people into a hole that they just like, I'm scared and I'm not coming out of it. So tell us what is next for you.
Well, I just finished writing a new novel. It is very dark and feministy and very queer and very underground and very South American. I wrote this book as part of a PhD dissertation. I'm finishing, I hope, a PhD at the University of Birmingham in the UK.
Nice.
That book is with my agent at the moment. We have not sent it out yet, but I hope we will soon.
Okay.
In the meantime, I had a pretty inspirational trip to various parts of Uzbekistan, Nukus, a village named Moynak, and what used to be the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea was once this vast body of water, and Moynak was a fishing village with a massive fishing industry, with big fishing vessels and canning industries. Anyway, that sea is now 10% what it used to be. That fishing village is now a 5-hour drive from what's left of the water, which is all polluted and over salinated with no more fish. I became very interested in the environmental disaster and the change in the climate that's happened in that area. And at the same time, very interested in this art museum in Nukus called the Savitsky Museum, which I'm also really fascinated by because it's got its own exciting backstory. I'm setting a novel in that part of the world. I just sold a murder mystery set at the Aral Sea, and I've never written a mystery before, but I thought this sounds like a fun thing to do. I wrote this murder mystery set there based on a prompt I found online, and I sent it off to a Canadian mystery magazine. They wrote back and said, "We'll publish this."
So those are a series of books, or what are those?
No, that's just a short story. It'll be in this Canadian mystery magazine. I was kind of
Nice.
tickled because I'm not previously a mystery writer, but now I am. Yeah. So I guess that's my next project is the novel that's set in the RLC, which will be different. Maybe there'll be a murder mystery. Maybe I should do that. I'll have to think about this and get back to you.
Yeah, and think about how that's going to go. Interesting. Well, thank you. Is there anything else you're going to be doing? Are you going to be doing it from the same country, or are we going to be shifting to another one for this book? How long have you been there?
Well, you know what, though? We have been quite a lot because, all right, it's a 4-year posting that my husband has here.
Okay.
The first however many months, my daughter and I were evacuated at the start of the first COVID wave. The British government evacuated us and sent us to London where we had nowhere to live. So we had to scramble to find a flat.
Wow.
We ended up spending 5 months in London, just the two of us, and then 7 months in France, just the two of us. And then finally getting reunited with my husband after 11 months apart. And then so my daughter had COVID in London and I got it in France and gave it to my husband when he came to visit. So we all had it. Then we finally came back here. So I feel like we've hardly been in Uzbekistan because we've had such an interrupted time and I keep having to move around the world alone with my daughter. You don't think when you marry a diplomat that you might end up living apart from him for 11 months. That's a challenge, and raising a child who's now 11 and amazing. We will be here for 2 more years, and I
Okay.
hope there will be no more evacuations. So I'll have 2 more years to travel as much as possible given the pandemic. But then after that, we have a permanent home in France. We bought a house there while we were posted to Bolivia because we thought it would be good for our daughter to have somewhere that doesn't change
Mhm.
so that there's an anchor and
Yeah.
so that we can leave stuff there and not have to pack it back up again. We've never lived there full time, but Theodore and I did live there for 7 months during the pandemic. We're hoping to live there after this posting, but we'll have to see. A lot will depend on money, finances, jobs, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Because I
Okay.
teach as well. I teach, I edit, I do other things. I mentor.
Does your daughter speak Spanish and English and any other language? That is such a gift.
She speaks
Yeah.
French. She was in
So
French
fair.
schooling. She was in French schooling her whole life, actually. She was in a
Okay.
Bolivian nursery school where she learned Spanish, and then a French school in Bolivia, which was partly in Spanish, partly in French,
Mhm.
and then stayed in French education until this year. She's currently in an international school in English for the first time.
It's such a gift because I know friends, he was Spanish, his wife was French, and they lived in America, and their twins can speak all 3 languages as if they are natives to the language. It's amazing.
I know, I'm
I am so
so
jealous because I'm
envious.
like,
I wish
yeah,
I'd grown up like that.
I love languages. Good for her. That'll be beneficial for her. She'll be able to move around naturally, learn languages probably easier, and make a choice of what country she wants to live in.
Yeah,
Are you nervous about that? That when she gets older, she might go way over there?
Yeah,
Might end up in China. You guys
Yeah.
haven't been to China yet.
I have no idea where she'll end up. She's unpredictable. She's
Okay.
learning Russian at the moment because we're here and they speak Russian and Uzbek and Tajik and a bunch of other languages.
Yeah.
I don't know where I mean, it's really interesting. We keep asking her regularly what she thinks of as home.
Mhm.
Where do you think of as home? And it changes. The answer changes.
Okay.
So
Yeah. She's young still, probably finding her ground. Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
weird. Like, I'm from the United States, but she's never lived there.
Yeah.
So
So,
she doesn't feel that American, I guess, but she has a passport.
right. Yeah. So maybe she'll try it. Maybe she'll go to school there. Maybe she'll go to college and she'll be like, you people.
That would require a
You
lot of
only speak
months.
one language? What?
I know.
Very
Yeah.
nice. So, well, thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing your journeys, sharing your travels. And we can't wait to read your books, especially this new one that will wait a couple of years. We'll give you a couple of years because we know that
Yeah,
babies, those kind of babies take a little while.
it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate you having me on your show.
Thank you. But before we go, what is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you after this taping?
You can email me through my website, which is jennifersteil.net. So it's Jennifer, JenniferSteil.net. Find information on my books there. You can also find me on Twitter at JFSteil7, so JFSTEIL7. I'm also on Instagram. If you just look for my name, Jennifer Steil, or I think my Instagram handle is Jennifer F. Steil, middle initial F. You can contact me through any of those places. There is a way to email me through my website if you would like to do that.
And then one other question, which I should have asked before, but what is one book you would advise every woman to read?
So I had a really hard time thinking about this because there are a lot of good books in the world. I've settled on one, which I was looking over just before we spoke. It's Maggie Nelson's book, The Argonauts, which I chose because it says such interesting and intelligent things about gender and identity and sexuality and parenthood and partnership and birth. I mean, a lot, and patriarchy and that sort of thing. And I just, every time I read her, I think maybe I could be that smart. She's pretty astonishing, Maggie Nelson. So The Argonauts. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. I did have one other question. What's one thing that you can't miss doing every day?
Moving my body. At the moment, because of all my injuries, I do ballet every day.
Do you? I love ballet. Love ballet. Okay. Yeah. So you do it in a studio? You do it at home?
I do it at home. I used to be a dancer when I was young, and I was fairly kind of traumatized by a fascist teacher, you know, how some of them can be. Yes. And also, I really wanted to be a professional ballet dancer at one point, but I do not have the body, the flexibility, the turnout, the extension, you know, all the things you really need.
I wanted to be one too. I had none of the attributes, but I loved it so much. So yes,
I know. I started doing it when we were evacuated to London and we couldn't leave the house. I was bored with yoga. I was doing yoga every day and I thought, I just need to do something. I feel like dancing. I want to dance. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do ballet because I did that. So I tried some jazz and some modern. And I was like, this is fun. This is okay. But then I took a ballet class and I thought, oh, but this is what I love. Like, I love this. And so yeah, I just have found a bunch of ballet teachers online whose classes I really love and find that I can follow them. And I just, even if it's just a ballet bar every day, it makes me feel like it's funny to be doing ballet and not be planning to be a dancer. There's something wonderful about it. There's no pressure. I can just enjoy the movement and the music. The fact that you're moving to music feels luxurious right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I am inspired because why not? Moving for yourself. And it's almost like, I mean, when I think back to dancing, it was almost like a spiritual thing. But, you know, like you said, if you're not going to be a dancer for life, then you got to find something else to do.
I mean, that was my thought when I quit. That was it. You can never go back because you can't ever be a professional. If you're not going to be a professional, then forget it. And when we were in Bolivia, my little daughter was taking ballet and actually got thrown out of a ballet school. We were looking for another ballet school for her. And they had her audition for this one. I mean, she was 4 or something. She was little. And they looked at her extension and her flexibility and they said, no, she's never going to be a dancer. She has terrible flexibility, terrible extension. And I said, oh gosh, I don't care if she's ever a dancer. I just want her to have the experience of doing ballet. I don't care if she's a professional. That's not why she's going. She's
Yeah.
4.
Yeah. That's the different perspective as well. And was it one of those schools where you have to stand up in front of the line? I've seen it on TV, or maybe it was a movie. Then they pull your leg up and they pull your feet to see if they flex enough.
I just thought I don't want her there anyway if they're going to be like that.
Yeah.
They're just going to destroy
Her
like
confidence and her
right.
love for the thing. Yeah. Nice. Well, I am inspired. Do you wear ballet shoes? Do you put the ballet shoes on too?
No, I don't wear tights because it's 100 degrees here. So,
Okay. It's a little hot for tights.
and because I'm doing it for myself alone, who
Yeah.
cares if I'm wearing tights? I do wear the ballet shoes because they help my feet look nice and
Right.
change how your feet move on the floor. I ordered them
Yeah.
online. I just ordered a pair of basic ballet shoes.
I'm going to get myself a bar in the basement. I said I should do that, but I was like,
should.
oh, you're too old to do a ballet.
No,
It's
you are not
ridiculous.
too old. You are never too old. I don't have a bar. I use a fireplace and an armchair. I don't have a proper bar. It doesn't matter as long as something you can
Something
rest
to
your-
lean on. Yeah.
Yeah,
Something.
that's
Well, we
it.
don't lean, but you rest, right?
Right.
That's
Rest.
what we lean.
My daughter, she will occasionally. She doesn't actually make fun of me. She's quite nice about it. But
Yeah.
if I'm doing a Swan Lake inspired bar, I'll be like, "Look, I'm a swan," and she'll say, "You're not a swan. You are a crazy lady waving her arms." Yeah.
I'm a swan in my mind and in my heart. Go back
I
upstairs
feel
and do your homework.
a swan. Yeah, exactly.
I love it. Thank you again so much for sharing and joining me.
It's
We'll
a
look forward to your
pleasure.
book.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun talking to you.